Viking witches, dark seer rituals of the north, in the far northern lands of Scandinavia, where the winters stretch into months of darkness and the seas rage with storms that swallow entire fleets. People believed in powers that lingered just beyond sight. The Vikings, known today as warriors, raiders, and explorers, were also a people who lived close to the natural world, a world that seemed alive with forces of fate, unseen spirits, and gods who demanded respect. Within this world, there existed women who stood apart from the rest, feared and revered in equal measure. They were the Völur seers, witches, and priestesses of an ancient art called Seiðr. The word vulva comes from staff-bearer, for the staff was both her weapon and her symbol. Archaeologists, centuries later, would unearth graves where these women were buried with iron-tipped staffs, sometimes decorated with runes, sometimes simple rods of power. In Viking society, the vulva was not merely a woman of herbs or charms. She was someone who was believed to speak to the very fabric of fate itself, to call upon unseen forces to change the course of battle, harvest, or destiny. Imagine her arrival in a Viking settlement. The sagas describe such moments, the people gathering in quiet awe as the seeress approached, cloaked in furs, with her staff in hand. She was often given a seat of honor in the chieftain's hall. Yet, at the same time, whispers would spread. For though she was honored, she was also feared. Hospitality toward her was not only a courtesy, was a necessity. To anger the vulva was to risk a curse. One of the most detailed accounts of a Viking, which comes from the saga of Eric the Red, where a vulva named Thorbjörg Elva, Little Vulva, is described in chilling detail. She wore a dark blue cloak set with precious stones. Around her neck hung glass beads, and on her head was a cap lined with white catskins. In her hand she carried the staff that gave her power. She was escorted to the seat prepared for her, given food from the best of the household stores, and treated with reverence. But it was what followed that struck fear into all present. She performed Seidr. The women of the household circled her, chanting old songs known as varlakur spells of enticement for spirits. These chants, ancient and eerie, called forth visions. The seeress then spoke of the future, predicting the fate of those gathered and the fortunes of the community. Her words were not vague. She named those who would die, who would prosper, who would see sorrow. And in a time when life was harsh and uncertain, her words carried the weight of truth. It is easy to imagine the hush in that longhouse, firelight flickering against wooden walls, as the Viviva's voice carried into the night. Each person must have wondered, was she speaking the will of the gods, or bending fate itself? Seidr was not the same as ordinary Norse magic. Other forms of magic like runic charms or healing herbs were considered acceptable, even honorable. But Seidr was something different, something more sinister. The sagas describe it as involving the weaving of fate, the calling of spirits, and the manipulation of both men and nature. To practice Seidr was to meddle in what should not be touched. For this reason, it was considered unmanly for men to practice it, an act of shame that could tarnish a warrior's honor. Yet kings and chieftains still relied on witches in times of need. Even the mighty Odin, the chief of the gods, was said to have practiced Seidr. This was one of the reasons his rival Loki mocked him. In the sagas, Loki sneers at Odin for taking up a woman's art, for lowering himself to something shameful. And yet, Odin's knowledge of Seidr made him the god of wisdom and fate. This contradiction, disdain on the one hand, and desperate reliance on the other, was at the very heart of how the Vikings viewed witches. The Völva existed in a liminal space. She was not quite part of the community, but not entirely outside it. She was welcomed when needed, but feared when present too long. In the stories, she is sometimes a helpful guide, offering visions and knowledge. At other times, she is a bringer of death, casting curses, calling storms, and weaving despair into the lives of those who cross her. To understand the fear these women inspired, you must imagine a world without modern explanations. When a storm rose suddenly at sea, tearing apart ships and drowning men, the survivors whispered of witches summoning the winds. When a sickness spread through a village, leaving the strongest warriors weak and broken, it was said a curse had been spoken. And when a prophecy came true, when someone met the exact fate the Völva had foretold, the people did not question the accuracy of her visions. They questioned what terrible powers had allowed her to see so clearly. Archaeological finds only deepen the mystery. Graves of Völur reveal not just staffs, but also strange amulets, pouches of herbs, and sometimes even hallucinogenic plants. Some scholars suggest that their rituals may have involved altered states of mind, visions induced by substances unknown to others. But to the Vikings, these trances were not chemistry. They were proof that the witch could step beyond the veil of this world. One might wonder, did these women truly believe in their power, or were they weaving illusions to maintain authority? Yet to ask this is to step outside the Viking worldview. For them, there was no firm line between what was real and what was supernatural. The world of spirits, gods, and curses was as real as the earth underfoot. And so, as night fell over Viking farms and villages, and the people sat by their hearths listening to the wind in the eaves, many would feel a quiet dread. Somewhere, perhaps close by, a Völva might be chanting, weaving, calling forth forces unseen, and no lock, no shield, no sword could defend against the unseen threads of fate she wove. But if the Völva could truly see the future, one must ask, did she also control it? Was she merely a messenger of destiny, or was she the hand that shaped it? This question, whispered in fear for centuries, has never been fully answered. Section 2. Rituals of Fear and Blood. If the presence of a Völva in a Viking hall stirred awe and unease, then her rituals were the stuff of pure dread. Seidr was never gentle. It was not the healing touch of herbs or the safe guidance of the runes. It was an art of control, of bending unseen forces, and, at times, demanding terrible prices. The sagas describe the process of Seidr with fragments that scholars have pieced together, like shards of a broken mirror. What emerges from these pieces is a picture of a ritual both mesmerizing and horrifying. The Völva would first prepare the sacred space. Her staff, sometimes tipped with iron, sometimes carved with strange runes, was planted firmly into the ground, as though she were staking her power into the earth itself. Around her, the women of the settlement, or those brave enough to assist, would form a circle. They began to chant the Varlokr, ancient songs whose purpose was to summon spirits and open the path to the other world. These chants were haunting, monotonous, and strange, filled with sounds that seemed older than language itself. To an outsider, it must have felt like being caught in a storm of voices, the air vibrating with tones that blurred the line between music and incantation. But Seidr was not only about song. It demanded sacrifice. In some descriptions, offerings of food and drink were placed before the spirits. In darker tales, blood was spilled. Animals, often goats or horses, were slaughtered, their life poured out into the earth to feed the unseen forces. Blood was power, and in a world where life was precarious, the giving of it was both a gift and a curse. Some rituals were even more unsettling. Later, Christian writers accused the witches of using human sacrifice, and though it is difficult to know whether these accounts are truth or propaganda, one cannot dismiss the possibility entirely. Viking society accepted human sacrifice in certain contexts, and if kings could demand blood for the gods, what might a witch demand for the spirits she called? Once the chanting reached its height, the vulva herself would begin to enter a trance. Some suggest that she inhaled smoke from burning herbs, perhaps henbane, a plant known to cause visions and delirium. Others believe the sheer intensity of the ritual, the chanting and drumming, was enough to break her into a different state of mind. In this state, she claimed to speak with spirits, to see the threads of fate, and to weave them as one might weave cloth. To those watching, her movements might have seemed unnatural, her voice shifting as though others spoke through her. The sagas do not shy from the darker aspects. A vulva could call storms, summoning winds to smash enemy ships against the rocks. She could lay curses upon warriors, sapping their strength before battle. There are even whispers of witches who could bind men's will, stripping them of courage and leaving them helpless. It was not only men who feared the seer. Women too lived in dread of it. A curse could fall upon a household, leaving children sickly or barren. Crops might fail, animals might die, and every misfortune would be whispered to be the work of a witch's hand. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect was the uncertainty. If a prophecy came, true if the sickness spread, if the storm struck, if the warrior fell in battle, who could say whether it was fate or the witch's doing? There are also stories of seer gone wrong, of witches consumed by the very spirits they called, their bodies convulsing, their eyes rolling white, their voices reduced to screams. To meddle with fate was to invite peril not only upon others, but upon oneself. One tale tells of a vulva who cursed a king, foretelling his downfall. The king's men seized her, dragging her from the hall, and tried to silence her. Yet as they struck her down, she laughed a laugh that echoed even as her blood stained the ground. Days later, the king fell in battle, just as she had said. Her curse, sealed in death, had taken root. For the Vikings, such stories were not superstition, they were warnings. Witches were not to be trifled with. To call one into your hall was to risk much, for though she might give answers, she might also give ruin. The rituals of Seidr were not only about seeing the future, they were about changing it, about pulling at the threads of reality in ways that could not be undone. And in a world where every life was already balanced on the edge of a sword, this was both a gift and a terror. As the firelight flickered against her cloaked form, as blood smoked on the ground and chants filled the night, the vulva became something more than human. To the eyes of the Vikings, she was a walker between worlds, a woman who could open doors best left closed, and once a door is opened, it does not always close again. Section 3. The Witches and the Gods. Seidr was not a craft born from mortal hands alone. To the Vikings, it was said to come from the gods themselves. But unlike the proud art of sword and shield, Seidr was shadowed with suspicion, for it was tied not to honor, but to secrets. At the heart of this mystery was Odin, the All-Father himself. He was the god of kings and poets, of warriors and wanderers. He was a god of wisdom, who sacrificed his eye for knowledge and hung himself upon Yggdrasil, the world tree, to learn the secrets of the runes. Odin sought power wherever it could be found, even in the forbidden arts of Seiðr. The sagas whisper that Odin practiced Seiðr, that he learned its ways from the goddess Freya, mistress of love, war, and witchcraft. With her, the boundary between beauty and terror blurred. Freya was revered as a goddess of fertility, yet she was also feared as a seeress whose magic could sway the fates of men. It was she who first taught the craft of Seiðr to the gods, and Odin was eager to claim it for himself. But there was a cost. Among the Vikings, Seiðr was considered a woman's art. For a man to practice, it was seen as shameful, even unnatural. The word ergia, term of insult, implying unmanliness, was thrown like a curse upon any man who dared step into its shadow. And yet Odin, the father of gods and men, embraced this shame for the sake of power. The poets sang of it with unease, calling him both mighty and tainted. For if even Odin could be mocked for Seiðr, what did that say of its dangerous allure? Some tales claim that Odin used Seiðr to see the threads of fate, weaving victory for his chosen warriors and ruin for his enemies. Others say he could cast his spirit forth, leaving his body behind, to travel unseen across the 9 worlds. But always the stories carry the same undertone, that Seiðr was as perilous for gods as it was for mortals. Loki, the trickster, mocked Odin for this practice. In the Lokasina, a poem of insults, Loki sneers at him. You practiced Seiðr, like the witches, like a woman that is unworthy of you. The insult was sharp, for to accuse a man of woman's magic was to strip him of honor. Yet Odin endured it, for the knowledge he gained was greater than pride. This divine connection only deepened the fear of witches among mortals. If the gods themselves practiced Seiðr, what limits could there be on its power? If Odin could sway battles and Freya could weave fate, what might Evolva in the mortal world command? And yet it also raised a darker thought. If the gods themselves could be tainted by Seiðr, might not the witches to be touched by forces far beyond mortal understanding? Some stories claim that witches were chosen by Freya herself, that their powers were gifts or curses from the goddess. Others believed that to practice Seiðr was to bargain with beings beyond the gods, ancient and terrible spirits that lurked in the dark corners of creation. When Evolva stepped into the hall, cloaked and staff in hand, the people did not see just a woman. They saw a reflection of Freya, of Odin, of forces too great to be contained. To welcome her was to open the door not only to prophecy, but to the will of the gods themselves. But gods are not always kind. Their gifts often carry a hidden blade, and the Seiðr that revealed fate might also seal it. For if Odin, in all his wisdom, could not escape the doom of Ragnartha, twilight of the gods, what hope had any mortal of escaping the fate spoken by a witch? The threads of Seiðr were long and unbreakable. Once woven, they bound kings and peasants alike, and those who dared to resist them often found themselves broken, as though their struggle only tightened the web around them. The witches of the Vikings were not merely servants of spirits. They were reflections of the gods' own forbidden power, and if the divine could be stained by such magic, then perhaps all who touched it were doomed. Section 4. Witch Trials and Restless Graves. For all their power and mystery, Viking witches walked a path shadowed by fear. To wield Seiðr was to invite suspicion, and suspicion often ended in blood. In the sagas, we read of kings who summoned witches for prophecy only to destroy them when the visions turned dark. A Völva might be revered one season and executed the next. Such was the double-edged fate of those who dealt in forbidden arts. Unlike later European witch hunts with their courts and pyres, Viking justice was swift and brutal. A woman accused of Seiðr might be drowned, stoned, or driven into exile. Yet death was not always seen as enough, for the greatest fear was not what the witch did in life, but what she might do in death. Archaeologists have uncovered graves unlike any others. In some, a staff lies beside the woman, a symbol of her craft. But often that staff is broken, snapped in two as though to sever her power. In others, iron stakes were driven through the body, pinning it to the earth, so it could not rise again. Some witches were buried with heavy stones across their chests, as if to weigh down the spirit within. These were not acts of respect, they were acts of terror. The people believed that a witch could return from death as a Draugr, restless corpse, swollen and blackened, walking the night to torment the living. To prevent this, they mutilated the bodies, binding them in chains, staking them through the heart, or even decapitating them. One saga tells of a witch whose grave was disturbed by locals. They claimed that even long after death, her eyes glowed in the dark, and her voice whispered on the wind. When storms lashed the coast, they said it was her spirit, angry at being trapped beneath the soil. Such stories blurred the line between superstition and reality. Were these just tales to frighten children, or did some graves truly stir with movement after burial? The Vikings themselves seemed unsure, for their burial practices suggest a fear too deep to be dismissed as myth. Even Odin, who embraced Seiðr, was haunted by the same truth, that the power to twist fate came at a terrible cost. The witches who walked among men carried the weight of that curse, and even in death they were denied peace. In the end, the fate of the Völva was always the same: revered, feared, and finally destroyed. Yet their memory lingers, still unbroken, staffs unearthed from the soil, in sagas whispered by firelight, and in the silent question that hangs in the night. Did the witches truly die, or do they still walk, waiting for the world to remember them? Story 2. The Blood Eagle, a Viking sacrifice of terror. The night was cold, the kind of cold that crept into the bones and made even strong men shiver. A fire burned low in the great hall, its glow dancing across the wooden beams as voices hushed into silence. Someone had spoken the words that froze the room: the Blood Eagle. Even among warriors who laughed at death, the mere mention of this ritual carried a weight that pressed against the chest. It was not an execution, not even a sacrifice, but something far darker, an act of vengeance that lived on in whispers long after the victims were gone. The story was said to begin with betrayal. When a man broke his oath, when he murdered kin, when his crime stained the honor of a family beyond repair, the punishment had to be more than a death, it had to be a message. The victim was forced down on his stomach, bound so that he could not struggle. A blade, sharp and unyielding, would then trace its path along the spine. One rib at a time was hacked apart and pulled outward until the chest was opened like the wings of some monstrous bird. Then the lungs were dragged from the cavity and laid across the back, trembling in the cold air as if trying to breathe one final time. Some say no man could survive long enough to witness such cruelty. Others argue that survival was not the point. What mattered was the act itself, the performance before the gods and the watching crowd. For those who witnessed it, the horror etched itself into their minds forever. Even if the victim was already dead before the lungs were displayed, the image was enough to make the ritual real. The sagas tie the blood eagle most famously to Ragnar Lothbrok and his sons. Ragnar, captured by the Northumbrian king Gla, was cast into a pit of serpents, his flesh pierced by venom as he sang of vengeance. When word of his death reached his sons Bjorn Ironside, Sigurd, Snake Indi, and Ivar the Boneless, their grief hardened into something darker. They swore that Gla would not meet an ordinary death, and when they finally captured him, they carved the blood eagle upon his back. Whether or not the story unfolded as told does not matter, for in the telling, Gla's fate became a lesson. To defy the sons of Ragnar was to invite a death so terrible that its details were still whispered centuries later. A king split open, lungs displayed like wings, his body transformed into a warning for all who would dare stand against the fury of the North. Historians argue whether such a ritual was possible, whether the human body could withstand the act long enough to resemble the tales. Some call it symbolism, poetry stretched into nightmare. Others claim that Vikings, skilled with blades and drenched in blood, could have made the attempt, even if the victim perished too quickly for the full spectacle. Yet, in the Viking world, the truth mattered less than the fear it inspired. The ritual lived because people believed it could happen, and belief was enough to shape terror. Picture the scene: a captured enemy dragged into the center of a frozen village. The crowd gathered close, the air filled with silence, broken only by the whetstone scraping a blade. The first cut is made, and with it, the message is delivered. This is not merely death, this is vengeance made flesh. No warrior, no king, no oathbreaker could forget the image. The ritual did not need to be performed often. The threat of it was a weapon in itself. And so the blood eagle passed into legend, an execution that may never have been fully real, yet was more powerful than any sword or axe. For what is more terrifying, the cruelty of the act, or the knowledge that men could imagine it, speak of it, and believe it enough to whisper the words that still silence a firelit hall-blood eagle? The tale of the blood eagle did not live only in the death of King Gla. Like a shadow creeping through the sagas, it appeared again and again, attached to men who met their end in ways that felt less like justice and more like curses. In the Orkneyinga saga, it is said that Earl Torfenor carved the eagle upon the back of Halfdan Longleg, a son of King Harald Fairhead. The story unfolds with chilling simplicity. Halfdan had wronged Einar's kin, and so when vengeance finally came, it was not delivered with the swift bite of a sword, but with a ritual meant to echo through generations. The sagas do not flinch in describing it. The back cut open, the ribs split apart, the lungs pulled out. Whether such details were written to shock or to preserve truth, no one could say. What mattered was that those who read or heard the tale were left unsettled, their stomachs twisting at the thought of what humans could do to one another. Among the Norse, cruelty was not aimless. Every act of terror carried a weight, a meaning, a purpose beyond the moment. The blood eagle was vengeance elevated into theater, a performance staged for gods and men alike. To those who carried it out, the ritual was said to offer Odin a sacrifice worthy of his gaze. while to those who witnessed, it bound fear tightly around their hearts. If one man could be made into such a spectacle, then who among them was safe? Imagine the stillness of such a gathering. A winter wind pressing through the trees, villagers standing shoulder to shoulder, eyes wide and silent, as the condemned was dragged to the center. The axe and sword, weapons of war, were not used here. Instead, a blade worked slowly, deliberately, each strike purposeful, each sound unforgettable. The ritual demanded patience, demanded that those present endured the same horror the victim felt. It was not a killing, it was a message written in blood and bone. And that message spread far beyond the village where it was performed. Word traveled swiftly in the Viking Age. Traders carried news across seas. Monks recorded whispers in their chronicles. Enemies repeated the tales in trembling voices. It was said that even those who had never seen the blood eagle feared it, for the imagination was often crueler than the eyes. The very idea of such a fate was enough to break men before they reached the battlefield. But in these same sagas, one sees the line between truth and legend blur. Some poets speak of the ritual with detail so exact it feels undeniable. Others hint that it may have been nothing more than a metaphor, a way of saying that a man's back was hacked open with such brutality that it resembled wings. Perhaps, they argue, the blood eagle was never real, only a story invented to magnify vengeance, to glorify cruelty, to make heroes seem more terrible in their wrath. Yet does it matter? To those who feared the Norse, the difference between fact and myth was irrelevant. The terror lived in their minds regardless. The Anglo-Saxon monks who chronicled the Viking raids wrote of the Northmen as if they were demons risen from the sea. They came in longships, black sails cutting across the horizon, eyes like predators, axes dripping with blood. To describe them as men might have diminished the horror of their raids, but to frame them as beasts who performed rituals like the blood eagle made them seem unstoppable, as though they were not bound by the same laws as ordinary mortals. The ritual, whether practiced or not, became a weapon in itself. And yet one cannot dismiss the possibility that somewhere, in some forgotten place, it was real. That one enemy, hated enough, feared enough, cursed enough, was dragged down and split apart in this most terrible of fashions. That screams were swallowed by the night as lungs heaved their final breath beneath the open sky. That a crowd stood in frozen silence, knowing they had witnessed something that blurred the line between man and monster. For that is the heart of the blood eagle's terror. It made men into monsters. It showed that beneath the skin of every warrior was a being capable of cruelty, so vast it could silence even the bravest. And it left behind a haunting question: what is worse, that the ritual was real, or that it was imagined and still believed? The memory of the blood eagle lingered long after the blade was put away. Whether witnessed in truth or told around the fire, it etched itself into the mind. It was not just the cruelty of the act, but the silence that followed. Those who had seen it rarely spoke of it openly, yet their eyes betrayed the weight they carried. A child who once clutched his mother's hand at the edge of a ritual site might grow into a man who decades later still woke in the night, certain he could hear the tearing of flesh and the ragged gasp of a final breath. Among the Vikings, death was no stranger, yet the blood eagle stood apart from ordinary slaughter. To fall in battle was an honor. To meet death beneath the wings of an eagle carved into one's own body was humiliation, a curse, a stripping away of dignity. The condemned was not sent to Valhalla with sword in hand, but left broken lungs, torn open for the gods to see. For those who believed in the old ways, it was not only penance, was exile from eternity itself. Priests of Odin and practitioners of Seiðr whispered that such rituals fed the gods directly. Blood was their wine, pain their offering, lungs their smoke. A warrior who died this way became a vessel, his suffering carried upward to the Allfather, who demanded sacrifice in exchange for victory. Whether these whispers were born of true belief or of fear, they deepened the ritual's terror. To resist the Vikings was not simply to risk losing one's life, it was to risk being turned into a sacrifice. One's body ripped apart, not just for vengeance, but for the gods themselves. The sagas spoke of men who trembled at the mere mention of the eagle. Enemies of the Norse would surrender before battle, begging for mercy, swearing oaths and handing over wealth, simply to avoid the fate they had only heard described. The ritual became larger than life and idea, more powerful than any sword or axe. In this way, the blood eagle did not need to be performed often. The fear of it was enough to conquer. But still, some accounts refuse to let it remain only metaphor. Archaeologists have uncovered skeletons scarred in ways that raise grim questions. Ribs split unnaturally, spines cut with precision, bones bearing marks that suggest they were pried open rather than broken in combat. While none can be proven beyond doubt, each discovery fuels the possibility that the ritual was real. That somewhere, long ago, under a sky heavy with storm, the eagle's wings truly spread. For those who tell the story, truth may not matter. Horror does not demand proof, thrives on uncertainty. The blood eagle endures not because we know it happened, but because we cannot shake the feeling that it might have. And in that uncertainty lies the deepest terror. That human beings, given reason enough, faith enough, or hatred enough, are capable of cruelty beyond imagination. The stories say that when the ritual was complete, silence always followed. No cheering, no drunken laughter, no triumphant shouts of victory. Only the heavy quiet of men who had glimpsed something they could never unsee. The warriors would walk away slowly, the firelight flickering behind them, the body left beneath the open skies, chest cracked wide, ribs splayed like wings, lungs exposed as if straining for one last breath. Some believed the gods themselves would descend to witness the offering. Ravens, sacred to Odin, often circled above the sites of execution. To the Norse, their presence was no coincidence. Were they feasting scavengers, or were they messengers of the Allfather, come to carry the victim's spirit into the mist? The sight of black wings cutting across a blood-red sky made the question feel less like doubt and more like revelation. For the condemned, there was no justice. Whether they were kings captured in battle, traitors torn from their own villages, or enemies unlucky enough to be chosen as examples, their end was the same. To become a blood eagle was to vanish into myth, reduced not to a person, but to a symbol of terror. Their names often faded from the records, while the ritual itself lived on in memory, stronger than flesh. And so the blood eagle survived, not in the ground, not in the brittle bones left behind, but in whispers and sagas that refused to die. Each retelling carried a shiver, as if the story itself demanded reverence, as if to speak it aloud was to invite the eagle to spread its wings once more. The truth may never be settled. Was it a ritual truly practiced by the Norse, or a tale invented to magnify their ferocity? Perhaps both. Yet, in the end, the line between myth and history matters little. For, to imagine, it is enough to see the firelight flicker, to hear the slow rasp of breath, to watch the eagle's wings unfold in the silence of the night. And long after the embers fade, the story remains. Story 3. The Draugr Undead Horrors of the Norse. In the long winters of the Viking North, when snow blanketed the earth and the nights stretched endlessly, fear was never far from the minds of men and women. It was a time when the veil between the living and the dead seemed thinner, when the crackle of a hearth fire could not always chase away the weight of silence pressing in from the darkness outside. In those moments, the people of the Norse lands told tales of the Draugr, beings who were neither alive nor dead, corpses that crawled from their graves with a hunger for vengeance and a thirst for destruction. Unlike the wandering spirits whispered of in Christian Europe, the Draugr was flesh and wrought. It was said to carry the smell of death wherever it walked, its body swollen, darkened, and grotesque. Some sagas spoke of Draugr that were pale and ghostly, while others described them as black as charred wood, their eyes burning like embers. They were the horror of the earth itself made flesh, reminders that even death offered no final rest. If the soul was filled with greed, hatred, or rage, the Norse believed that death was not a simple release but a passage. A warrior who fell honorably in battle might be chosen for Valhalla to feast eternally with Odin. Others might wander to Hell, a cold and shadowy realm under the watch of the goddess Hel. Yet, for some, the journey never began. These were the ones who clung to the soil, who could not let go of treasure, power, or revenge. They became Draugr, bound to their burial mounds, guarding their wealth with a fury no mortal hand could calm. Archaeologists have uncovered Viking burial sites with strange protections, bodies pinned beneath heavy stones, heads separated from torsos, iron spikes hammered into flesh. Why would such care be taken unless the living feared the return of the dead? The sagas confirm it. Some men and women were so dangerous in life that their neighbors feared they would be worse in death. A corpse left whole might rise again, its fingernails grown long and sharp, its skin stretched tight and purple with death. The only way to prevent this horror was to break the body, to cripple it, to hold it down so it could not claw its way back into the world of the living. The Icelandic sagas are filled with chilling accounts of Draugr. In Grettir's saga, the hero Grettir faces Glamour, a shepherd who dies in the snow and returns as an undead terror. Glamour's corpse grows so swollen that no horse can carry him, his strength rivaling the strongest of men. By day, he lumbers through the valleys, crushing livestock, breaking doors, and leaving death in his wake. By night, his glowing eyes pierce the darkness, driving men mad with fear. Glamour was no ordinary ghost. He was a Draugr, and only brute strength could silence him. Grettir fought him for hours, grappling with the stench of death and the crushing weight of Glamour's rotting body. When the monster finally fell, his curse lingered. Grettir would live a life filled with fear of the dark, forever haunted by what he had seen. But not all Draugr were monstrous giants. Some were subtler horrors, creeping into the homes of those they once knew, sitting by the hearth in silence, their pale faces staring into the flames. Families would wake to find food eaten, animals slaughtered, or the heavy weight of a corpse pressing upon their chest as they slept, stealing the breath from their lungs. In this way, the Draugr blurred the line between dream and reality, between nightmare and waking life. Could it be that what some experienced as sleep paralysis, the Vikings explained as the visitation of the undead? To them, there was no doubt. Something foul lingered in the night. Treasure was often at the heart of the Draugr myth. Vikings buried their wealth with their dead, believing it would be carried into the afterlife. But greed, the sagas warned, could tether a soul to its mound. Many stories tell of men who sought to plunder these graves, only to be torn apart by the Draugr guarding them. The undead were not mindless, they possessed cunning strength and the malice of their former selves. To battle one was no easy feat. Only fire, decapitation, or total destruction of the body could ensure it would never rise again. Some accounts even describe the use of stakes driven through the corpse, or salt and herbs packed into the grave as protection against its return. The fear of the Draugr was not just a superstition, it shaped how the Norse treated death itself. Families were careful with funerals, making sure to honor the dead properly so they would not return. A neglected burial could spell disaster for a village. Imagine the terror of a winter night, the wind howling against the wooden walls of a farmhouse, when a heavy knock rattled the door. Outside, in the snow, stood the swollen figure of a dead neighbor, his skin blackened, his mouth twisted in rage. What words could you offer then? What prayers would matter? To the Norse, such moments were not only possible, but inevitable, if one lived carelessly. And so the Draugr was not only a tale to frighten children, it was a warning. Live with honor, die with peace, or risk returning as a thing of rot and terror. It was a reminder that greed and hatred outlived the flesh, that the worst parts of humanity did not always die with the body. But still, the question lingers. Were the Draugr simply myth, or were they born of something the Vikings truly experienced? Archaeological evidence of dismembered corpses suggests genuine fear. The sagas, though written centuries later, contain consistent details of their appearance and behavior. Could these tales have been rooted in real encounters, diseased bodies mistaken for monsters, or visions in the half-light of endless winter nights? Or was it something deeper, something unexplained, that still lies waiting in the frozen soil of the north? The Draugr remains one of the most enduring horrors of Viking belief. Not a ghost of mist, not a shadow in the woods, but a corpse of flesh and bone, rising where it should not. And if you lived in the Viking Age, on those nights when the storm raged and the fire dimmed, you might have wondered, would tonight be the night the dead came knocking? The world of the Draugr was one of endless dread. For the Vikings, who lived at the edge of survival, life was already filled with danger storms at sea, raids from rival clans, famine in winter. But nothing struck fear more deeply than the thought of the restless dead clawing their way from the soil. When a person was buried, there was a fragile hope that the grave would hold them fast. But the stories warned otherwise. Many sagas tell of nights when the ground itself seemed to shift, when the mounds that marked the dead swelled as though something stirred beneath. Villagers whispered that if one placed an ear to the earth, they might hear the groan of the Draugr struggling to rise, the grinding of bone and dirt as they forced themselves free. In these tales, the Draugr was no helpless shade, possessed an unnatural strength. Some accounts describe them lifting entire oxen, or crushing a man's ribs with a single embrace. Their bodies were grotesquely preserved, swelling in death until they became almost giant-like, with sharp, blue-tinged nails that could rip through armor. Their eyes glowed with a sickly, ghostly light, as though the fires of hell burned within them. To see a Draugr's gaze was to know terror that froze the blood. The sagas give us chilling examples. In Eyrbyggja saga, a chieftain named Thorolf Twistfoot is buried improperly, and his corpse rises to haunt the living. He brings plague upon the land, poisoning livestock and causing strange sickness among the people. His Draugr is so fierce that even after his burial mound is opened, he refuses to rest. Only after his body is dug up, burned, and his ashes cast into the sea does the haunting cease. Such stories served as warnings. Improper burials could unleash horrors upon entire communities. Battles with Draugr were legendary. Warriors spoke of them as foes more terrifying than any human enemy. Grettir, the Strong's encounter with Glamour, remains one of the most famous. After Glamour's death, his corpse grew unclean, filled with the unnatural power of the Draugr. When Grettir confronted him, the fight raged for hours, crashing through the snow and into the hills. Grettir's sword was useless against the Draugr's hardened flesh. Only brute force could prevail. Finally, with immense effort, he pinned Glamour beneath the moonlight and cut off his head. Yet, even in defeat, Glamour cursed him, robbing Grettir of peace for the rest of his life. It was proof that the Draugr could reach beyond death, binding a man's fate long after the fight was done. What made the Draugr so terrifying was not only their physical strength, but their cunning. Unlike mindless corpses, they were said to retain fragments of human thought, twisted by greed and hatred. A Draugr could scheme, lay traps, and torment its victims with cruelty. Some stories tell of them sitting atop their own graves, watching travelers with a grim smile. Others slipped into homes, not with violence at first, but with a sinister patience, moving objects, whispering names, letting families know they were never alone. It was psychological torment, long before the final blow came. The fear of the Draugr shaped burial practices. Vikings developed rituals to keep corpses from rising. Stones were sometimes piled atop graves, heavy enough to pin the body down. In other cases, stakes were driven through the chest or abdomen to hold the corpse in place. Some sagas speak of cutting tendons or breaking bones before burial. The living did what they must, for if the Draugr rose, entire villages could suffer. One particularly haunting ritual involved the so-called corpse door. In some parts of Scandinavia, the dead were carried out of a house not through the main entrance, but through a special opening cut into the wall. Once the body was removed, the door was sealed, ensuring the spirit could not find its way back inside. For the Vikings, such practices were not superstition, but survival. And still, the stories grew darker. Some Draugr did not linger quietly in their mounds, but actively sought the living. In Gisli's saga, the dead returned to destroy entire households, appearing in dreams first and then in flesh. Villagers spoke of hearing heavy footsteps on their roofs at night, of doors shaking under a corpse's fists. To sleep in such times was to risk waking with the Draugr's weight crushing your chest, its cold, foul breath stealing the last of your life. The Draugr's connection to treasure was another source of dread. Greedy in life, they became even greedier in death. Many sagas tell of warriors who tried to plunder burial mounds for gold, only to find themselves face to face with a Draugr. In Hervarar saga, a maiden named Hervor seeks out the cursed sword Tyrfing, buried in her father's grave. When she calls upon him, his Draugr rises in full armor, his voice echoing from the darkness, warning her of the doom the sword carries. Hervor takes it nonetheless, showing that even the bravest could not resist the lure of wealth, though they knew the price. To fight a Draugr was no small task. Weapons often failed against their hardened flesh. Fire was the surest way, burning the body until nothing remained but ash. Decapitation was another, but even then, some sagas claim the head continued to speak or laugh after separation. Salt, iron, and runic charms were also used to protect against them. But none of these were guarantees. Sometimes the Draugr returned again and again, each time more vengeful than the last. Imagine, then, what it must have felt like to live in such fear. The endless nights of winter, the howling winds outside, the creak of the house settling in the cold. Every sound could be a warning, every shadow the approach of something unspeakable. For the Norse, the Draugr was not just a story, but a very real possibility, a nightmare that might claw its way into reality at any moment. What made these stories endure was not only their terror, but their reflection of human fears. The Draugr embodied the things that plagued the living: greed, vengeance, envy, unfinished business. In a way, they were not only the dead, but the parts of the human soul that refused to die. The sagas turned these traits into flesh, gave them bodies, and set them loose upon the land. Even today, the Draugr has not faded from memory. In modern tales, they inspire images of zombies and revenants, but the Norse version remains far more chilling. It was not an endless horde of the undead, but a singular, personal horror: your neighbor, your chieftain, your kin rising from the earth, with a face you knew, twisted into something monstrous. That was the true terror, not the stranger in the dark, but the familiar hand that once gave you bread, now reaching to take your life. And so the Draugr lingers, both in story and in the soil of the North. Were they myths born of fear and superstition, or were they something more, something the Vikings truly saw with their own eyes? The sagas do not offer easy answers, only warnings. And perhaps, in the frozen silence of ancient burial mounds, the Draugr still waits. The northern night was long, cruel, and filled with whispers of the past. In such darkness, the Draugr thrived, a reminder that death was never truly final. To the Vikings, these revenants were not simply figures of superstition, they were warnings carved into memory, carried from one generation to the next. And in the most terrifying sagas, their cruelty reached unimaginable extremes. The Draugr did not always haunt strangers. Often they turned upon their own kin. Tales speak of fathers rising to curse their sons, of wives clawing their way from earth to torment their husbands, of brothers dragging one another into the grave. The Vikings understood what made this horror so unbearable. It was not the unknown specter that brought fear, but the return of the familiar, twisted and hateful. Imagine waking to the sound of your mother's voice, calling your name, only to open the door and see her corpse, half-rotted, smiling, with blackened teeth. In Laxdilla saga, there is the account of a woman named Thorgunna. Before her death, she demanded a proper burial, with no part of her belongings kept in the house. But her requests were ignored. Soon after, strange hauntings began. Food spoiled overnight, livestock died suddenly, and people whispered of a shadowy figure watching them as they slept. It grew worse. Those who disrespected her wishes fell ill, coughing up black blood, their eyes hollowing as if something had sucked the life from them. Thorgunna had returned, not in peace, but in vengeance. The Draugr here was not a mindless corpse, but a spirit bound to her own anger, twisting the world around her. Other stories tell of Draugr who wielded powers far beyond human comprehension. Some could change their shape, appearing as animals, or stretching themselves to monstrous size. A shepherd might see a great black bull in the mist, only to realize it was the corpse of a man he once knew, his face grinning from between twisted horns. Others could slip into dreams, poisoning the mind before striking the body. It was said that if you dreamt of a Draugr standing by your bed the following night, you would never wake again. The violence of these revenants was unmatched. In Grettis' saga, Glamour was not content to haunt the night. He dragged men from their beds, tore apart flocks of sheep, and left fields stained with gore. Villagers found corpses not simply killed, but mutilated bones shattered, flesh peeled away as though gnawed upon. Some stories even claim the Draugr fed on the blood of the living, biting into their throats like wolves. The line between ghost, demon, and vampire blurred in these tales, and for the terrified Norse it hardly mattered. To battle such creatures was to risk your soul. Warriors who entered burial mounds seeking treasure often emerged broken, if they emerged at all. In Eyrbyggja's saga, men who disturbed the graves of the dead faced waves of hauntings. They reported a stench so foul it made them vomit blood, the sound of bones cracking in the earth, and hands clawing from the soil to drag them under. Or some sagas even describe Draugr that could infect others. Those they killed rose as revenants themselves, swelling the ranks of the undead. The threat was not simply one monster, but an outbreak that could consume an entire settlement. To prevent such horrors, burial rituals grew ever more elaborate. Bodies were sometimes buried with iron scissors across the chest to cut any attempt at rising. Nails were driven through the soles of the feet to pin them down. Sometimes the corpses were laid face down, so if they tried to dig, they would only burrow deeper into the earth. Yet even these measures were not foolproof. The most desperate defense was fire. When a Draugr plagued a village, its body was exhumed, hacked into pieces, and burned upon a pyre. But even this brought danger. Some accounts tell of the corpses screaming as they burned, cursing the living with their last breath. In one tale, the smoke from a burning Draugr was so poisonous it killed all who inhaled it. The dead, it seemed, could strike even in destruction. The Vikings also turned to Seiðr, the dark sorcery often practiced by witches and sorcerers. Charms were carved into wood and stone, runes etched in blood, spells whispered to bind the restless dead. But these arts were perilous. To wield magic against the Draugr was to risk corruption, for the undead carried with them the touch of Hel, the goddess of the underworld. A sorcerer who dared such work could find themselves marked forever, their soul tainted, their sleep filled with nightmares of cold hands dragging them down. Perhaps the most terrifying belief of all was that the Draugr could spread its curse through mere presence. A house where one appeared became drawbidden, doomed to sickness, madness, and ruin. Families fled their farms, leaving behind homes and fields rather than risk staying. Villages became ghost towns, abandoned to the fear that the dead still walked. One haunting legend tells of a grave mound near Asafjörður in Iceland. Locals said no one who passed by at night returned alive. Travelers were found torn apart, their bones scattered like kindling. Finally, a brave group of warriors attempted to end the curse. They dug into the mound and found a corpse sitting upright, grinning with broken teeth, clutching a sword across its lap. When they tried to strike, it rose, towering over them, its eyes burning like fire. The men fled, save one who was crushed beneath its hands, his body broken in an instant. The mound was resealed, the dead left undisturbed, and the land was cursed ever after. And so, the Draugr was more than a monster, it was a reminder. To the Norse, it was proof that death could not be trusted, that even the grave held no peace. It embodied the worst parts of humanity: greed, envy, rage magnified in death. A Draugr was not born of chance, but of character. Those who lived wicked, selfish lives were doomed to rise again, bound forever by the weight of their sins. This is why the stories lingered long after the Viking Age ended. The fear of the Draugr crept into later Scandinavian folklore, merging with tales of ghosts, revenants, and vampires. Even today, in the wind-swept hills of Iceland and Norway, there are places where people avoid walking at night, where old mounds are left untouched, where silence falls a little too heavily. Ask the locals why, and they may smile, shake their head, and say, best not to disturb the dead. The Draugr's legacy stretches far beyond Scandinavia. It lives on in every story of the restless dead, every film that shows corpses rising from the grave. But unlike the shambling zombies of modern imagination, the Draugr was intimate, personal, and cruel. It did not hunger mindlessly, it hated with purpose. It chose its victims. It remembered their names. Imagine it now, the endless night of a northern winter, the snow drifting against the door, the wind shrieking like a chorus of spirits. You sit by the fire, hoping the flames will keep the shadows at bay. Then comes the sound, the slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps in the snow outside. Closer, heavier, the door creaks, and you see the outline of a man you once knew, a neighbor, perhaps even a kin. His skin is gray, his eyes alight with an unholy glow, and his lips twist into a grin. He has returned, not in peace, but in hunger for your fear. That was the terror the Vikings carried, the knowledge that death was not the end, but only the beginning of something far worse.